For 9 years, the billionaire's daughter lived in complete silence. The best doctors in America all said the same thing. She was born deaf, nothing can be done. Her father spent millions trying to prove them wrong. Private hospitals, experimental treatments, specialists from 3 different countries. But every answer led back to the same devastating sentence: learn to accept it. Then one night, a maid cleaning the family's mansion noticed something strange inside the little girl's ear. Something dark. Something no doctor had ever mentioned. At first she said nothing, because she wasn't a doctor. And if she was wrong, she could destroy her life forever. But when the little girl collapsed crying in silence just days later, the maid made a decision that changed everything. What she pulled from that child's ear shocked the billionaire father, and what happened seconds later left the entire house frozen. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Whitmore estate sat high above the Connecticut shoreline like a palace built to impress God himself. 42 acres. Iron gates. Marble fountains. Windows taller than most houses. From the outside, people called it beautiful. Inside, it felt haunted. No music drifted through the halls. No laughter echoed across the marble floors. No televisions played in the background. The servants walked softly. Even the dogs barely barked. Because everyone in that house had learned the same painful truth. Silence ruled everything, especially after Amelia Whitmore died. Richard Whitmore stood alone in his office, most nights staring at the framed photograph on his desk. His wife, her smile, the tiny baby wrapped in pink blankets resting in her arms. That photo had been taken less than 4 hours before Amelia bled to death during childbirth. Their daughter survived. Amelia didn't. And from the moment little Elise opened her eyes, the doctors discovered something else. She couldn't hear. Not partially. Not slightly. Completely deaf. Richard spent 9 years trying to fix what fate had taken from him. Private specialists. Experimental surgeries. Doctors flown in from Switzerland. Clinics in Tokyo. Neurologists from Boston. Every expert said the same thing. Congenital deafness. Permanent. Irreversible. Accepted. Richard never accepted anything in his life. He built a billion-dollar shipping empire from nothing. He negotiated with governments, crushed competitors, bought politicians, won every battle money could reach. But this wouldn't move. No amount of power could force sound into his daughter's world. And that failure slowly hollowed him out. By the time Elise turned 9, Richard barely slept. He worked late, avoided people, ignored invitations. Sometimes he stood outside Elise's room at night, listening to silence on the other side of the door. It destroyed him every time, because he knew she'd never hear him say goodnight, at least. That's what he believed, until the new maid arrived. Grace Holloway arrived at the Whitmore estate during the coldest week of October. Rain hammered the windshield of her old Honda as she pulled up beside the servant entrance. The engine coughed twice before dying. Grace closed her eyes. "Please don't break down today," she whispered. Everything in her life felt one step from collapsing. Her mother's medical bills sat unopened on the kitchen counter, 3 months overdue. The bank had already sent warning letters. Her younger brother Caleb needed tuition money, and the nursing home had called twice that week threatening to transfer her mother to a lower care facility. Grace couldn't let that happen. Her mother had sacrificed everything after Grace's father abandoned them, worked double shifts, skipped meals, stayed awake nights sewing clothes for extra money. Now cancer had reduced that once unstoppable woman to fragile bones beneath hospital blankets. So Grace took every job she could, waitressing, cleaning offices, night shifts, and now this, housekeeper for one of the richest men in America. She stepped into the rain clutching her purse tightly. The mansion towered above her, massive, cold, perfect. A woman in a gray uniform opened the back door, tall, sharp features, eyes that missed nothing. "You're late," the woman said. Grace glanced at her phone. "It's 8:01. "Exactly," Grace swallowed. "I'm sorry." Woman studied her for several seconds. "Mrs. Holloway," Grace blinked. "That's my last name too." "No relation," the woman replied coldly. "Follow me." Grace walked through the mansion. She noticed the silence immediately, not peaceful silence, heavy silence, the kind people carry after funerals. No one smiled, no one talked above a whisper, even the workers looked emotionally exhausted. Then Grace saw her. A little girl sitting alone beside a giant window, long dark hair, blue sweater, tiny hands arranging colored blocks into perfect rows. She looked up briefly, and Grace noticed something strange. The girl touched her right ear, then winced, just slightly. Mrs. Holloway noticed Grace staring. "That's Elise." Grace nodded softly. "She's beautiful." Mrs. Holloway's expression hardened. "Not interfere with the child." Grace looked confused. "I wasn't, Mr. Whitmore does not allow staff becoming emotionally involved. You clean, you work, you keep distance." Grace nodded. But as they walked away, she glanced back. Elise was still touching her ear, and this time Grace saw pain in her eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace learned the rhythm of the Whitmore estate. Breakfast trays at 7, laundry by 9, dusting upstairs hallways before noon, dinner prep by 5, silence all day. But no matter how busy she stayed, she kept noticing Elise. The child was always alone. Always quiet, always touching her right ear. At first Grace tried ignoring it. Doctors had probably checked everything. Who was she to question specialists? Still, something bothered her. One afternoon she found Elise sitting beneath the grand piano, tracing her fingers across the wooden floor, feeling vibrations. Grace's chest tightened. The girl looked up. Their eyes met. Grace smiled gently. Elise hesitated, then gave a tiny smile back. That moment changed everything. The next morning Grace left a folded paper crane beside the window where Elise usually sat. Nothing more, just a tiny paper bird. By evening it was gone. In its place sat a drawing, a shaky sketch of the bird, and beneath it, written carefully, "Thank you." Grace stared at the note for a long time. Something about it broke her heart. After that, tiny exchanges began. Candy wrappers folded into stars, small notes, drawings, smiles. Grace learned some simple sign language online late at night after work. Elise seemed shocked someone cared enough to try, and slowly, she opened up. She showed Grace her sketchbooks, pictures of oceans, birds, clouds, and one drawing repeated over and over, a woman with long hair, her mother. One evening Grace signed carefully. "Do you remember her?" Elise shook her head, then pointed to her chest and signed, "I miss her anyway." Nearly cried. That same evening she noticed something else. Elise rubbed her ear harder than usual, then flinched. Grace leaned closer, inside the ear canal. Something dark, something deep, something wet-looking. Grace froze. A memory slammed into her. Her cousin Daniel, doctors believed he was partially deaf for years. Turned out severe impacted buildup had blocked almost everything. One procedure changed his life. Grace's pulse quickened. No, impossible. Doctors would have seen it, wouldn't they? Richard Whitmore barely noticed the staff anymore. He moved through life like a ghost, wearing expensive suits, board meetings, phone calls, business dinners, then home to silence. But lately something had changed. Elise smiled more, not often, but enough for him to notice. One night he paused outside the sunroom. Elise sat at the table laughing silently while Grace folded paper flowers. Richard stood frozen. He hadn't seen his daughter laugh like that in years. Grace noticed him first and immediately stood. "Sorry, sir, I was just—" But Richard raised a hand. Elise looked toward him, then quickly signed something to Grace. Grace smiled softly. She said, "The flower I made looks terrible." Stared, then unexpectedly, he laughed. A real laugh, brief, rusty, like a sound unused too long. Elise's eyes widened. She couldn't hear it, but she saw it. And for the first time in months, Richard felt warmth enter the house. Later that night, he found himself thinking about Grace, not romantically, not even personally, just curiously. She treated Elise differently, not like a broken child, not like a tragedy, like a little girl. It mattered more than he expected. Still, he kept emotional distance. Because every time he hoped for something better, life punished him. And hope had become dangerous. 3 nights later, everything changed. Rain battered the windows. Most of the staff had gone upstairs. Grace was cleaning the west hallway when she heard a muffled thump. She turned instantly. Elise lay curled beside the staircase, clutching her right ear. Tears streamed down her face. Silent agony. Grace rushed to her. "Elise." The girl trembled violently. Grace signed quickly. "Can I look?" Elise hesitated, then nodded. Grace gently tilted her head and froze. The dark blockage had moved closer, swollen, pressing outward. Her heart pounded. This was wrong. Seriously wrong. How had no doctor noticed? Elise grabbed Grace's wrist. Fear filled her eyes. Grace understood immediately. Doctors, hospitals, pain. The child was terrified. Grace hugged her carefully. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Even as she said it, panic churned inside her, because she knew something now, something terrifying. If she did nothing, Elise would keep suffering. And if she acted, she could destroy both their lives. Grace didn't sleep. She sat awake in her tiny room, staring at the ceiling until nearly dawn. Every possibility ran through her head. Tell Richard. He'd call doctors, the same doctors who already missed it. Say nothing. Elise continues suffering. Try helping herself. Potential disaster, lawsuits, arrest, ruined life. She buried her face in her hands. God, what am I supposed to do? Her phone buzzed. A text from the nursing home. Payment required within 72 hours. Grace closed her eyes. If she lost this job now, her mother's care would disappear. Everything depended on this income. Everything. But she couldn't erase the image of Elise crying silently on the floor. Around 3 a.m., Grace remembered something her mother used to say. Sometimes the right thing costs everything. She whispered the words aloud, and somehow she knew what she would do. Richard left for New York the next evening. Storm clouds rolled over Connecticut. Thunder shook the windows. Most of the estate settled early. At 9:17 p.m., Grace heard another crash. She ran. Elise had collapsed beside the hallway table. Her face was pale, both hands pressed desperately against her ear. Grace's heartbeat exploded. This was worse, much worse. "Elise, look at me." Child looked terrified. Grace reached into her apron pocket. Sterile gloves, tweezers, a small flashlight. She had prepared them after the previous episode, just in case. Her hands shook violently. "I'm going to help you," she signed. Elise stared at her, then slowly nodded. Grace swallowed hard. "Lord, guide my hands." She gently positioned the flashlight. The blockage was visible, dark, large, unnatural. Grace carefully inserted the tweezers. Elise squeezed her eyes shut. Grace moved slowly, carefully, then she felt it. Resistance. She adjusted, pulled slightly. Nothing. Her pulse thundered. One wrong move could hurt the child. She tried again. A little deeper. Hook, pull. Suddenly movement. Something shifted free. A thick dark mass slid outward into Grace's hand. She stared in horror. Years of hardened, impacted material mixed with infection. And then Elise gasped. An audible gasp. Grace froze. The little girl's eyes widened. She looked around wildly. Thunder cracked outside. Elise jumped. Her hands flew to her mouth. Another sound, the grandfather clock ticking, tick, tick, tick. Elise pointed toward it, trembling. Grace burst into tears. "You hear that?" Elise looked terrified and amazed all at once. Then she touched her throat, opened her mouth, and whispered her first word. "Mom." Grace sobbed harder. "No, baby, that's thunder." Elise began crying, actual crying, with sound. Tiny broken sobs. Grace pulled her into her arms. "You can hear," she whispered. "Oh my God, you can hear." Then a voice thundered behind them. "What is happening?" Grace spun around. Richard stood frozen in the doorway. Rain soaked his coat. His eyes locked onto the tweezers, the blood, the dark mass. Then Elise looked up. "Daddy." Richard stopped breathing. The word shattered him because for the first time in 9 years, he heard his daughter's voice. Richard dropped to his knees. "Elise." His voice cracked apart. The little girl stared at him. Tears streamed down her face. "Voice?" she whispered slowly. Every syllable sounded rough, unpracticed, fragile, but real. Richard's hands trembled as he touched her face. "You can hear me?" Elise nodded, then flinched as thunder exploded again outside. Everything overwhelmed her. The storm, the clock, the sound of breathing, her own crying. Richard looked toward Grace. "What did you do?" Grace held up the dark blockage carefully. This was inside her ear. Richard stared. His face changed. Shock. Confusion, rage. "You touched my daughter without permission." "Sir, she was in pain." "You could have injured her." Elise grabbed Richard's sleeve desperately. "No." The sound of her voice stopped him cold. He looked at his daughter, really looked, the wonder in her eyes, the terror, the miracle. And suddenly his anger collapsed beneath crushing emotion. He pulled Elise against his chest and sobbed. Years of grief poured out of him. Grace quietly stepped backward, but Richard looked up. "Leave," she froze. For several long seconds no one spoke, only thunder. Then Elise touched Richard's cheek. "Daddy?" "Yes, baby." "What does rain sound like?" Richard broke completely. Doctors arrived within the hour, emergency specialists, audiologists, ENT surgeons. The estate transformed into chaos. But for once, hopeful chaos. Tests confirmed something unbelievable. Elise's hearing pathways worked, partially weakened from years of blockage and infection, but functioning. One older doctor removed his glasses repeatedly. "I don't understand how this was missed." Richard's expression turned deadly. "You charged me $11 million over 9 years. No one answered. Grace sat quietly outside Elise's room while specialists examined her. Fear twisted inside her. Had she crossed a line? Would Richard fire her once the shock faded? Would lawyers come next? Finally, the bedroom door opened. Richard stepped out. His eyes were red, exhausted, but softer somehow. "Doctors said you likely saved her hearing." Grace looked down. "I just saw something everyone else missed." Richard stared at her. "No," his voice shook. "You cared enough to keep looking." Grace didn't know what to say. Then Elise's voice called weakly from inside. "Grace." The maid covered her mouth instantly. Richard smiled through tears. "She wants you." Grace entered slowly. Elise sat upright in bed looking overwhelmed. Tiny sounds startled her constantly. Machines, footsteps, fabric moving. The world had exploded open. Grace sat beside her. Elise touched her hand. "Voice is pretty," burst into tears. Because no one had ever said that to her before, news traveled fast. By morning, every employee in the mansion knew the deaf girl could hear. And the maid had done what world-famous doctors couldn't. Some servants cried, some prayed, some looked terrified. Mrs. Holloway looked stunned. She found Grace in the kitchen. "I told you not to interfere." Grace lowered her eyes. "I know, Mrs." Holloway studied her for a long moment, then quietly said, "Thank God you didn't listen." Elise experienced her first sunrise with sound. Birds outside the windows, ocean waves crashing in the distance, wind through trees. She cried repeatedly. Every sound felt magical. At breakfast she startled when silverware touched plates, then laughed. A beautiful, awkward laugh. Richard couldn't stop watching her. For years he thought he understood grief. But this joy, this overwhelming, impossible joy, it frightened him almost as much. Because he finally realized how close he came to giving up. And if Grace hadn't walked into their lives, Elise might have remained trapped forever. 3 days later, Elise asked about her mother. Grace was helping organize colored pencils while Richard worked nearby. Suddenly, Elise looked up. "Mommy, sing." The room went still. Richard stared at her. What did she sound? Face crumpled. For years he avoided speaking about Amelia because the pain was unbearable. But now his daughter could finally hear. She deserved answers. Richard walked slowly to his office. Returned carrying an old cassette recorder. His hands trembled. "I haven't played this in years." He pressed the button. Static crackled. Then a woman's voice filled the room, warm, soft, laughing. Elise froze. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. "That's her." Richard nodded. Amelia's recorded voice continued. "If our baby ever hears this one day, I love you already more than the world." Elise collapsed into sobs. Richard held her tightly. Grace quietly wiped tears from her own face. And in that moment, something changed forever inside the Whitmore house. The silence finally began dying. Within a week, reporters gathered outside the estate. Someone leaked the story. A billionaire's deaf daughter suddenly hearing after a maid intervened. America became obsessed. Morning talk shows, news segments, medical debates, experts arguing online. Some praised Grace, others condemned her recklessness. One television doctor called her dangerously lucky. Richard watched the interview silently, then turned the television off. "They said the same thing about my daughter for 9 years, he muttered. Law firms contacted him. Medical boards launched investigations. Hospitals panicked. Richard ignored everyone. His focus remained on Elise. The little girl experienced the world like someone arriving on another planet. She loved clocks, rain, dogs barking, music boxes, ocean waves. But one sound fascinated her most: laughter. She kept making Richard laugh just to hear it again. And every single time, he cried afterward. One evening, Richard found Grace preparing to leave after her shift. "I need to speak with you." She looked nervous instantly. Am I fired? Richard stared at her, then slowly shook his head. No, handed her an envelope. Grace opened it. Inside sat a check. Her breath stopped. It was enough money to pay all her mother's medical expenses, enough to erase her debts, enough to change her life. I can't accept this. You can. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I didn't help Elise for money. I know. Richard's voice cracked slightly. That's exactly why you deserve it. Grace looked away, trying not to cry. Then Richard said quietly, she asks about you constantly. Grace smiled softly. She's special. No, Richard replied. You are. Even after her hearing returned, Elise struggled. Sounds overwhelmed her. Crowds terrified her. Sometimes she covered her ears and cried. One afternoon she smashed a plate accidentally when the kitchen noise became too much. Richard rushed in. Elise trembled violently. Broken, she whispered. Richard's heart shattered. Before he could answer, Grace knelt beside the girl. No, sweetheart, your brain eye learning. Elise looked unconvinced. Grace gently placed Elise's hand over her own heartbeat. Slowly, she whispered. One sound at a time, and that became their routine. One sound at a time. Birds, piano notes, wind chimes, laughter, rain. The world unfolded carefully, and little by little, Elise stopped being afraid. Late one night, Richard found Grace sitting alone on the back steps. You should be home, Grace shrugged. Couldn't sleep. Richard sat beside her. For a long moment they watched the ocean, then he spoke quietly. I blamed Elise for years. Grace looked shocked. Richard stared ahead. Openly, never aloud, but every time I looked at her, I remembered losing Amelia. His jaw tightened. And when the doctors said she'd never hear, he shook his head. I thought maybe God was punishing me. Grace listened silently. Richard laughed bitterly. Some father, right? No, Grace's voice was gentle. It's the grieving one. Richard looked at her. No one had ever said that before. Not therapists, not friends, not business partners, just her. And somehow those few words loosened something locked inside him for nearly a decade. 2 weeks later, Grace discovered Elise sitting at the grand piano, randomly pressing keys, listening carefully. That one sounds blue, Elise said. Grace smiled. What about this one? Elise pressed another note. Gold. Richard watched unseen from the doorway. His daughter looked alive, not trapped. Not isolated, alive. A piano instructor began visiting us weekly. Within months, Elise learned melodies by ear. Doctors called it remarkable. Richard called it a miracle. One evening, Elise played a slow and finished tune while Grace cleaned nearby. What's that song? Grace asked. Elise smiled shyly. I'm writing it. Who? Elise looked toward Richard, then toward Grace. The people who gave me sound. Richard turned away quickly so they wouldn't see him crying. The medical investigation exploded nationally. How had elite specialists missed something so basic? Lawsuits followed. Hospitals denied responsibility. Some claimed the blockage developed recently. Others blamed previous clinics. Richard unleashed the best legal team money could buy, not for revenge, for accountability. Because how many other children were dismissed too quickly? How many parents were told to accept it before every possibility was exhausted? The case dominated headlines for months. But through it all, Grace avoided cameras. She refused interviews, refused talk show offers, refused sponsorship deals. One reporter finally cornered her outside grocery store. Why won't you tell your side? Grace answered simply. Because this story isn't about me, it's about a little girl hearing her father say goodnight. Clip went viral across America. By December, the Whitmore estate looked different. Music played softly, staff laughed, lights glowed warm against snowy windows. And for the first time in years, Richard hosted Christmas. Elise woke before sunrise, excited. Nervous, everything still felt magical. Wrapping paper crinkling, fire crackling, Christmas songs. Then she heard something outside, bells. She ran to the window, sleigh bells from a horse carriage passing the estate. Her mouth fell open. It sounds like stars, she whispered. Grace cried immediately. Richard laughed through tears. Later that morning, Elise handed Grace a small wrapped box. Inside sat a silver necklace. Tiny engraved words, "Thank you for helping me hear Thurald." Grace hugged her tightly. Best Christmas present she'd ever received. Spring arrived, and with it came change. Grace received an offer from a major nonprofit organization. They wanted her to help advocate for overlooked medical cases. The salary was enormous, the opportunity life-changing. But accepting meant leaving Connecticut, leaving Elise. The night before her decision, Grace sat with Elise in the garden. Would you forget me if I move it away? Grace asked softly. Elise looked horrified. Never. Grace smiled sadly. Still have your dad. Elise thought carefully, then signed and spoke at the same time. But you helped him here too. Grace's eyes filled instantly because the child was right. Richard wasn't the same man anymore. None of them were. That evening Richard found Grace packing books in her room. Leaving, Grace nodded slowly. I think I'm supposed to. Richard leaned against the doorway. You changed this house. Grace smiled faintly. No, Elise did. He shook his head. She brought sound back. Then after a long pause, you brought life back. Grace looked down. The silence between them felt warm, no, not heavy, not haunted, healing. The next morning Elise ran across the front lawn as Grace loaded her old Honda. Wait, Grace turned. Elise hugged her tightly. You promised you wouldn't disappear. Grace knelt. Only a phone call away. Elise smiled, then whispered, I love you. Completely broke down, because the little girl who once live-trapped inside silence now spoke love freely into the world. Richard walked forward carrying a small envelope. Grace sighed. You already paid me too much. This isn't money. She opened it. Inside sat paperwork. A fully funded medical foundation in her mother's name, dedicated to helping children receive a second opinions. Grace stared speechless. Richard smiled softly. You reminded me what happens when someone refuses to give up. Tears rolled down Grace's face. The ocean wind moved through the trees. Birds sang overhead. And Elise stood between them listening to every beautiful sound life had almost stolen forever. That night after Grace drove away, Richard tucked Elise into bed. The room glowed softly in moonlight. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windows. Elise smiled. Like rain. Richard brushed hair from her forehead. Me too. She looked at him carefully. Daddy? Yes, baby. Can you say it again? Richard's throat tightened. What? Elise smiled sleepily. That you love me. Richard leaned down, kissed her forehead, and whispered the words once feared she'd never hear. Love you more than the world. Elise closed her eyes smiling. And for the first time in her life, she fell asleep listening to the sound of her father's voice. That first night after Elise heard her father's voice, she didn't sleep, she tried. Richard stayed beside her bed until nearly midnight while specialists moved quietly through the mansion downstairs. But every sound startled her awake again. The air vent humming, floorboards creaking, rain tapping the windows. A dog barking somewhere far beyond the estate gates. The world was loud, too loud. At 2:13 a.m., Richard heard soft crying. He rushed into Elise's room. She sat upright in bed, trembling violently, both hands pressed over her ears. Make it stop, she whispered. Richard's heart shattered. For 9 years he begged God for his daughter to hear. Now sound itself frightened her. He sat beside her carefully. It's okay, he whispered softly. But Elise shook her head hard. The walls make noise. Richard listened. Pipes, wind, tiny things he'd stopped hearing years ago. To Elise, it sounded like chaos. Then another sound filled the room, footsteps. Grace appeared quietly in the doorway. Richard looked exhausted. I don't know how to help her. Grace crossed the room slowly and knelt beside the bed. Elise, she said gently, look at me. Little girl's breathing shook. Grace took her hand carefully and placed it against her own heartbeat, steady, slow, calm. Listen to one sound at a time. Elise tried, her breathing slowed slightly. Grace pointed toward the rain. Focus only on that. The child listened. Tiny drops against glass, soft, rhythmic, not dangerous. Elise's shoulders slowly relaxed. Richard watched silently from the corner. And for the first time in years he realized money couldn't comfort his daughter the way compassion could. That realization humbled him more than any business loss ever had. By morning, someone leaked the story. No one knew who. But by 9 a.m., news vans crowded outside the Whitmore estate. Headlines. Deaf billionaire child hears for first time. Maid succeds where SBCLISTS failed. Miracle OR medical negligence. Richard stood in his office staring at television screens. Every channel discussed Elise. Some doctors defended the medical system. Others looked nervous. One clip exploded online faster than all the others. Security footage from the hallway, blurry, grainy, but visible. Grace kneeling beside Elise. Then Elise reacting to sound for the first time. Millions watched it within hours. Comment sections flooded instantly. She saved that little girl. Did every doctor miss this? The maid cared more than specialists. God sent her there. But not everyone supported Grace. A famous television physician called her reckless. What she did could have permanently damaged the child's ear canal, he said during a live interview. Grace saw the clip while sitting alone in the servant kitchen, her stomach twisted. Maybe he was right. Maybe she'd just been lucky. Then Elise entered quietly holding a small notebook. She wrote something and slid it across the table. "I heard BIRDS this morning." Grace's eyes filled instantly. Then beneath it Elise added, "Thank you for my life," and suddenly the criticism didn't matter anymore. 3 nights later Richard couldn't sleep. The mansion was finally quiet again. He wandered downstairs and found Grace sitting alone near the fireplace reading her Bible. "You really believe God sent you here?" he asked quietly. Grace looked up. "I believe people are placed where they're needed," stared into the fire. "I used to believe things like that." Changed, he laughed bitterly. "Wife died." Settled heavily between them. After a long pause he continued, "You know what the worst part was?" Grace listened carefully. "I was relieved when she stopped screaming." His voice cracked. "The delivery complications lasted hours. She was terrified, begging doctors to save the baby. Begging me not to let her die." Swallowed hard. "And at some point I just wanted the suffering to stop." Filled his eyes. "I've hated myself for that thought ever since." Grace's chest tightened. 9 years carrying that guilt alone." "She loved you," Grace said softly. Richard stared at the fire. "You don't know that." Grace smiled sadly. "A woman doesn't fight that hard for someone she doesn't love." Richard finally looked at her, and for the first time since Amelia's death, he cried in front of another adult. Not controlled tears, not quiet grief, real grief. The kind he'd buried beneath billion-dollar buildings and endless work. Grace didn't interrupt. Sometimes healing begins when someone simply stays. A week later Elise discovered music, and everything changed again. It started accidentally. A pianist arrived for one of Richard's charity events. While guests filled the ballroom downstairs, Elise sat hidden on the staircase listening. Her entire body froze. The melody drifted through the mansion like light, soft, gentle, alive. Elise slowly walked toward the piano room. The pianist noticed her immediately. "Would you like to come closer?" Elise hesitated. Richard watched nervously nearby. The pianist played a single note. Elise jumped slightly, then smiled. Another note, another smile, then suddenly tears rolled down her cheeks. "What's wrong?" Richard asked quickly. Elise looked at him with overwhelming emotion. "It feels like colors moving." The room fell silent. Even the guests nearby stopped talking. The pianist quietly motioned Elise closer. "Put your hand here." Elise touched the piano while he played. The vibration traveled through her fingertips. Sound and feeling merged together. And for the first time in her life, the world didn't feel empty anymore. That night she asked Richard a question that nearly destroyed him. "Mommy liked music too?" Richard nodded slowly. "She loved piano." Elise smiled through tears. "Then maybe she heard this with me." Richard had to leave the room because he couldn't breathe through the crying. 2 weeks later a thick envelope arrived at the mansion. No return address. Richard opened it during breakfast. Inside sat hundreds of handwritten letters from parents all across America. Stories poured from every page. Children dismissed by doctors, misdiagnoses, ignored symptoms, years of suffering. One mother wrote, "They told us my son would never walk." Another doctor later found a spinal infection everyone missed. "Your daughter's story gave us hope to keep searching." Read every letter silently, then look toward Grace. "We're not the only family this happened to." Grace nodded softly. "No, sir." Richard stared out the window. For years he believed money protected people. Now he realized something terrifying. Even billionaires can be ignored when experts stop caring enough to look closely. And poor families, they often never get a second chance at all. That realization changed him forever. Late one evening Elise woke thirsty. She walked downstairs quietly. Halfway through the hallway she stopped. Someone was crying softly, broken. She followed the sound to Richard's office. The door sat slightly open. Her father sat alone holding Amelia's photograph, crying into his hands. Elise had never heard crying before, not really. It sounded painful, heavy, human. "Daddy." Richard looked up instantly, embarrassed. "Elise, what are you doing awake?" She walked slowly into the room. "Were you hurt?" Richard wiped his face quickly. "Baby." "Then why are you crying?" He looked at Amelia's photo. "Because sometimes loving someone hurts after they're gone." Elise studied him carefully, then climbed into his lap. For several minutes neither spoke. Finally Elise whispered, "I think Mommy still hears you." Completely broke down again. And this time he didn't hide it from her, because his daughter could finally hear every word he never thought she'd understand. In the weeks that followed, Elise changed again. Not back to silence, but into something new, awareness. Everything had sound now. And that was not always gentle. The clinking of dishes made her flinch, footsteps in the hallway startled her. Even the wind outside the windows sometimes made her cover her ears and breathe too fast. Richard tried to adjust everything. Soft carpets were added to the hallways. Doors were padded. Staff were instructed to move more quietly than ever before. But the world could not be silenced again. One afternoon, Elise broke down in the garden. "I don't like loud anymore," she whispered. Grace knelt beside her immediately. "That's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to like everything you hear." Elise looked confused. "Will it always feel like this?" Grace hesitated. She said gently, "Your brain is learning. It takes time." Richard stood nearby, watching. He realized something painful in that moment. Healing was not a miracle moment. It was a long adjustment. And for the first time, he feared not the past but the future. The media storm didn't fade. It grew. Doctors debated. Hospitals released statements defending themselves. Some called Grace a hero, others called her a liability. Then came the lawsuits, not against Grace, but against multiple medical institutions. Parents across the country came forward. Stories mirrored Elise's: misdiagnoses, missed conditions, years of unnecessary suffering. Richard's legal team expanded rapidly. But he didn't feel victorious. He felt disturbed. Every case meant a child who had suffered longer than necessary. One night he said quietly, "How many children were told to just accept it?" Grace didn't answer, because there was no comforting answer. Despite everything, Grace tried to stay invisible. She refused interviews, refused awards, refused recognition. But one morning she received a letter from the nursing home. Her mother's condition had worsened. Emergency treatment required. Immediate payment needed. Grace sat on her bed staring at the paper for a long time. For months she had stayed in the Whitmore estate, helping Elise, stabilizing routines, becoming something like family. But her real life had not stopped breaking. That night she told Richard she needed to leave. He didn't argue, he just listened. Elise overheard and froze. "You're leaving?" she asked quietly. Grace knelt instantly. "I have to take care of my mom." Elise's eyes filled. "Will you come back?" Grace hesitated too long. And that silence was enough. Elise stepped back. "Everyone leaves." The words were small, but they cut deep. Richard's expression changed instantly. Elise, no, but the child ran upstairs. And for the first time since she gained hearing, she chose silence again. The mansion changed overnight, not physically, emotionally. Elise stopped speaking. She still heard everything. But she no longer responded. She ate quietly, played alone, avoided Grace completely. Grace stayed even after she had prepared to leave, because she couldn't leave like that. But nothing she said reached the child. One evening Richard found Elise sitting under the piano again. But this time no sound came from her, not even laughter. "She's scared," Grace whispered. "What?" Richard asked. "Losing people again." Richard looked away, because he understood that fear too well. That night Richard made a decision. He called Grace into his office. "I'll cover your mother's treatment," he said. Grace immediately shook her head. "I can't accept more from you." "It's not charity," he replied. "It's repayment." She frowned. "For what?" Richard looked tired. "For giving my daughter her life back." Grace stayed silent, then softly, "That's not something you repay." Richard nodded slowly. "I know." A pause. "Just don't want you to leave her." Grace looked down. "She's not mine to keep." Richard's voice softened. "But she feels safe with you." That sentence stayed in the room long after she left it. The next morning Elise finally spoke again. She stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at both of them. "If I say something," she asked, "will people always leave?" Her voice was small but steady. Grace stepped forward slowly. She said gently, "People leave for many reasons, but not because you're not worth staying for." Elise processed this carefully. Then asked, "Did Mommy leave because of me?" The question broke everything open. Richard stepped forward immediately. He said firmly, "Never because of you." Elise's eyes filled. "Then why?" Richard struggled. "Because no answer would feel fair." Grace knelt beside Elise. "Life is unfair," she said softly. "But love doesn't leave because of you. It leaves because it's out of control." Elise nodded slowly, then whispered, "I don't want to be afraid anymore." That afternoon something shifted. Elise walked into the garden alone. Birds were singing, wind moving through trees. She closed her eyes, and instead of flinching she listened. Grace watched from the window. Elise slowly smiled, not because the sounds were perfect, but because they were hers. She walked back inside and found Richard. "I heard the wind today," she said. Richard smiled faintly, and it sounded like breathing. A pause, then she added, "I think the world is alive." Richard turned away quickly, overwhelmed. Months passed. The lawsuits settled. Hospitals changed protocols. Second opinion systems were implemented in multiple states. Grace's mother recovered enough to return home with ongoing care, and Grace finally prepared to leave again. This time, Elise did not stop her, but she walked her to the car. Elise held a small notebook. She wrote something and handed it to Grace. Inside it said, "Don't disappear from the world." Grace smiled through tears. "I won't." Elise hugged her tightly and whispered, "I love you." Grace froze. Because those were the first full words of love Elise ever spoke without fear. That night, Richard found Elise at her bedroom window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked up. "Sounds different now." He sat beside her. "Different how?" "Like I'm inside it instead of outside it." Richard nodded slowly. "I used to feel outside everything too." Elise looked at him. "Not anymore." He shook his head. "No." A pause, then softly, "Because of you." Elise leaned against him. And for the first time, neither of them felt broken in silence. Years later, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a monument of silence. It felt lived in. Music echoed through the halls. Guests laughed openly. Children visited for medical programs funded by the Whitmore Foundation. Elise stood at the piano one evening, older now. Grace had returned that day for a visit. Richard watched quietly from the doorway. Elise played a soft melody, then stopped. She turned. "I used to think silence was my world," she said. She smiled faintly. "But it was just waiting for sound." Grace wiped a tear. Richard stepped forward, and for the first time in years he wasn't carrying grief, just gratitude. Elise finished her song, and the last note lingered in the air like something finally healed, not perfect, not painless, but whole. And as the sound faded, no one wished for silence anymore.